Welcome everybody. My name is Matthew Taylor and this is National Science Week. So our webinar today looks at the science that underpins our conservation work to discover how to put the logic in ecological monitoring. Now it's going to be a sort of ecology 101, so warning, there may be some complex diagrams ahead, but we'll have some wonderful guests with us today who are going to help demystify this for us. Now before we kick off, I'd like to start by acknowledging the Kaimari people of Sydney's North Shore and all traditional owners across Australia in all the regions that people are joining us and in all the regions that we work, and acknowledge their work on the land for many millennia. And I'd like to pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging. Now, for the webinar, as usual, please feel free to introduce yourself in the chat room. So that's the chat button at the bottom, and if you tell us your name and where you're joining us from, and the traditional owners, if you know it, that would be fantastic. As we go along, if you've got any questions, please put them in the chat function, and we'll have time at the end for our guests to answer them. So joining us today, we have three of the brightest minds and most passionate members of our science and conservation team. Clair Dougherty is our conservation planning manager. Vanessa Westcott is our gun ecologist who looks after our Nari and Yantabula reserves, which are way out the back of Burke. And we have a special guest joining us, Hedley Grantham, our new chief scientist. So welcome everybody. Hedley's going to be joining us just at the end, but welcome Vanessa, welcome Claire. So let's kick off. Claire, I'd like to start by asking you, you're one of the wise heads in our organisation. You've been with us for, I think, 15 years and have outlived most people in the organisation. Have you always been in the science and conservation team?
Thanks, Matthew, and it's a real pleasure to be here today. And I just would like to acknowledge that I'm sitting on Wurundjeri country in Preston, in I'd like to say sunny Melbourne. It's not so sunny today. And also acknowledge all the traditional owners across the land which we work and play and live. So yeah, your question, Matthew. So 15 years ago, a lifetime ago, there weren't as many people working at Bush Heritage back then, and I did start in Melbourne. I was in Melbourne still then, and so I was in the planning team, which means basically myself and there was one other person. And that other person was basically the operations manager, the chief ecologist, and also the planner. And so there was, I think there were 3 ecologists. There was a number of course, field staff, reserve managers. We didn't have healthy landscape managers back then. But so I guess the answer to the question is yes, I was in the science and planning team, but it was a much smaller team, but I was still doing the planning. So that's where I kind of started.
Fantastic. Well, with that history, I think you're probably the best person to start us off today with an overview of our conservation management process, which is, I know, core to all the work we do in terms of our planning, what and how we work with our reserves. So please give us an insight.
Yeah, thanks, Matthew. That's correct. So, so the way that we plan for our conservation projects is that we've been using this process for a long time now and able to have developed and adapted the process, which is interesting. It's an adaptive management process. It's a 5-step process, and you can see the steps there on the screen. A lot of people talk about adaptive management, but you kind of get to the implement stage and then often you kind of, zip off into go down a different track. But this process really is designed to help you keep going around the loop and closing the loop. So you get to that kind of point where you're feeding the data back into the system. You've got clear objectives and goals that you've stated, and then you're able to then feed that information back in and then truly analyse and adapt how you're working and feed it back in to improve things. It's based on a global standard called the Open Standards for the Practice of Conservation, and try and say that really quickly 5 times. They call it the conservation standards for short. You can easily just Google conservation standards if you're interested to see about this process. And our process draws heavily on that process. Just the next slide. Thanks, Megan. Just quickly, it's a project management process. So there's kind of 3 building blocks. I won't go into too much detail in the actual steps, but there's 3 building blocks in the process, and one part of it, which is in that assess phase, is getting a picture of what's happening at a particular site. And it's really important because it's collaborative. It makes sure that everyone's on the same page. It's bringing in lots of different ways of thinking, and we all think differently. And this is a way of kind of mapping out what the situation is. It's called a situation analysis. You don't need to see all the words there. It's probably quite small for you. But there's kind of logic in the colours. So that the green box in the middle, they're called targets, and they're the things that we care about, and they'll represent the ecological and cultural importance of a particular site. And then the pink boxes are the things that are the problems that are impacting on those targets. So the things that we need to manage to improve the health of the targets. That's what we're all about. And then you've got those yellow hexagons, or the outline of the yellow there, and there'll be the strategies that we're going to implement to mitigate threats and then improve the health of our targets. So the diagram just helps to note out the kind of ecological, the political, the social logic of a site, and that helps us to then think about what we need to do and who we need to work with to actually implement those strategies. Another key building block of the process, if you just pop to the next slide, thanks Megan. Again, we'll get your binoculars out if you want to see what the words are, but again, this is another part of the building block. So the situation analysis is current, and the results chain, we call this a results chain. Some people call them roadmaps or theories of change. And this is going to tell us what we want to see in the future. And if you read it from left to right, again, you can see those green football shapes. It's all about the targets. Targets are the things we care about. And on the left, you've got your strategy. And this is just an example of a feral predator management strategy. And then in between that, from left to right, there's a whole bunch of things that we want to do. There's a whole bunch of results that we want to see. And this is where we build our monitoring and evaluation program. I think you can just see there's little purple triangles on some of those boxes. That's where we monitor things. They're indicators. So there'll be a selection of different types of indicators along that roadmap or results chain, where we're going to make sure that what we said we're going to do is actually what's happening. Just quickly, the next slide. So those little purple triangles, again, those indicators, there's 3 levels of monitoring for us. There's output, so we want to know how much effort, how many people were involved, how much money, how many kilometres of fencing did we erect, how many kilometres of fire breaks did we grade, that kind of thing. Then there's outcomes, we want to see a reduction in the threat. And then impacts, ultimately, we want to see at least a maintenance of the health of a target, or better still, improvement of the health of the target.
That's fantastic, Claire. One of the things that I know I often get asked about is when we're buying new properties. We've recently acquired properties, Eddie Garrop in WA, the John Douglas block in Victoria, and Glover's Flat in Tassie. What's actually involved in assessing their conservation values initially? Because presumably we do assess that at a fairly detailed level, don't we, before deciding to purchase?
That's right. And doesn't that picture make you want to kind of go like this and look out over the landscape? It's beautiful. So properties that we've acquired, it goes through a pretty extensive assessment. And we have varying levels of how we plan things. So we'd love to work all across Australia, but we can't because we're not big enough. So we need to prioritise, and it's all about prioritising. So we have priority landscapes, and those priority landscapes are based on a bunch of different criteria: protected underrepresented ecosystems, specific species, important, significant sites, strong alignment with traditional owners, that kind of thing. So at the higher level, climate resilience, we have the criteria for priority landscapes. And then at the property level, that criteria filters down. So it's the same thing. So for example, with the Glover's Flat reserve that we've recently acquired in Liffey Valley in Tassie, we're looking at, again, back to those green footballs that I mentioned before in those diagrams, the things that we care about, those targets. So there'll be, are there targets from the priority landscape on the property? Are there those protected underrepresented ecosystems and species? significant sites and connection to traditional owners, that kind of stuff, and climate resilience, and what are the threats. So it filters down. It's the same kind of criteria, but it gets more and more focused in as we get closer into different properties and partnerships.
Fantastic. Well, I'd like to turn to Vanessa now, because I know you've worked in many different parts of Australia and you love being out bush. I believe you started in the grasslands west of Melbourne, which are vanishingly small, but amazing, as I've driven through them, but also in the shrublands in WA. And then you decided to come and join us here in cold and wet New South Wales. Obviously, there's a hidden question there about why, but what actually made you want to work in conservation in the first place?
Yes, hi everyone, thanks for calling in. So yes, I grew up on the banks of the Billabong Creek near Clair, near Albury in New South Wales, with big giant river red gums, and my parents bought a property that had been heavily grazed, and we took all the stock off and over the years watched it regenerate. We watched little tiny red gum seedlings grow into big trees, and then the native grasses come back underneath, and the bird life was amazing, and there were tree houses and dinghies, and it was an amazing childhood, and I'm really grateful for it because it did sort of create in me this passion for conservation and nature. So yeah, so that was so I grew up on Wiradjuri country, and I find myself back here now in Orange in New South Wales on Wiradjuri country again, and I want to acknowledge the traditional owners here. Thanks.
Nice. Well, listen, what can you tell us about some of the biodiversity indicators that Claire's referenced that you engage with and measure, and tell us a bit about the function that data plays in day-to-day landscape management? Because I know people often hear us talking about, we do feral control, we do weed control, we occasionally do reintroductions, but data is a huge part of that, isn't it?
Yes. So I guess, as you mentioned, Matt, so now my role, I've worked for Bush Heritage for 8 years, and my current role is an ecologist, and I focus on Nari and Yantabulla out the back of Burke on Dougherty country. And I guess, so some of the biodiversity indicators. So what we do, as Claire said, is we have a management plan for the reserves, and we have our targets, the things we want to look after, and our threats. And that really drives the sorts of things we need to, the indicators and the monitoring that needs to be done. And I thought an example to give you all today would be around feral pigs. So one of the biggest threats to our conservation, or ecological and cultural values on Nari and Yantabulla are feral pigs. So we've developed a strategy, as Claire said, with those diagrams that are really logical steps. And that, that strategy outlines the methods we're going to use. It outlines the responsibilities of staff, the timing, the costs, all those sorts of things. And work really closely with the reserve manager as the ecologist, and with traditional owners and other Bush Heritage staff to really identify what data we need to collect. And as Claire said, there's 3 key components or indicators. And the first one for feral pigs is around outputs, which is around the effort we put in to removing those feral pigs. So it will be using the methods set out in the strategy, how many animals did we remove, how much time did it take, and some other data associated with that about where the animals were removed and methods used and all that. So that's really important indicator data, so summarising the effort we put in to removing or reducing the threat of feral pigs. And then we have the outcomes, which are really important. And in this example, it's have we actually reduced the threat? So do we have less pigs on the property? Can we see that our efforts have reduced pig numbers? And that's a tricky question. But what we've decided, the way we approach that is a big array of motion sensor cameras out, and they're running all year round, all across the properties. And what basically they do is take a photo. When a pig walks past, they take a photo. When any animal walks past, they'll take a photo, and we can then see how many pig photos we're getting and do some fun analysis on that to hopefully see that our efforts are leading to a reduction in pig numbers. And so that's the outcome data. And I think with pigs, we can also learn about seasonal trends when they're breeding. We can learn around which parts of the property they're most active, so we can be really targeted in our management. And we can learn about what times of the day they're active, and all that other sort of really important data comes out of that as well. So now we've got how much effort we put in, have we reduced the threat? But the critical question, which sometimes gets lost in conservation, for funding reasons and staffing reasons, is that third really important step, which is around collecting impact indicator data. And that is around, is the bush looking better because of that work? So sure, you've taken a few pigs away, you've got less pig activity, but does the bush look better because of it? And that's your impact indicator. And that needs some careful thought. Sometimes it's really quite straightforward, but for pigs at Nari, what we're doing is, because we always want to work closely with our traditional owners, we've identified a process by which we're going to identify certain culturally and ecologically significant wetlands where pigs do their wallowing around the fringes. And that's got an ecological effect in terms of promoting the growth of weeds and killing plants and things, but it's also where a lot of cultural artifacts are. So it's got a cultural, it causes damage to cultural values as well. So what we're going to do to measure our impact is to walk those fringes of those wetlands together and try to demonstrate a reduction in the damage associated with pigs in those areas. So that's an example of an impact indicator. And just finally, when you have those three types of information in front of you, you can then be truly adaptive, like Claire said. You can close the loop. You can say, well, I've put way too much effort in there, but I didn't actually make a difference to the threat. Or I did make a difference to the threat, but it wasn't enough to really get that impact I was looking for. So that's when you can be adaptive and really smart in your conservation efforts.
Yes, fantastic. Well, that leads directly to what I was going to ask Claire about, which is we have a whole process, don't we, for capturing data and examining these changes over time so that we get some impacts, measure the impacts and get some insights into, what the landscape health is. Can you tell us a bit more about that and our use of scorecards?
Yeah, thanks, Matthew. So it's going back to those building blocks again. So if you look at that results chain and the 3 layers of monitoring that Vanessa was talking about. So over time, we've developed a monitoring program, and some of those, the key, how we choose monitoring sites will be representative areas that capture variation, and then also replication of different targets. And because of those green footballs, it's about those. So we look at the attributes of the targets, what are the key characteristics of them, and that's where it helps to build that monitoring program. So over time, we're implementing the monitoring, we're going out and taking measures. We're feeding that data back into the system. There's standard methods and indicators and also standard ways of analysing the data. And then through that data analysis, we're able to gain insights onto how we're tracking in terms of the general target health, the mitigation of threats, and how we're also going with research projects and the day-to-day implementation of strategies. And so that becomes part of an evaluation process and a report that we generally we generate every 5 years. And it's a rather big, detailed report that goes through all of the science and the general activity that we're implementing on a reserve. But the scorecard is that kind of higher level visualization of how we're tracking. So you'll see the colours and the arrows and trends. It's a bit like your dashboard on your car. You don't need to know how the motor's running. We stop at the car and open up the bonnet, but all you need to see is how fast the car's going and other bits and pieces. So the scorecard is just that higher level a communication tool for ourselves and for our supporters and for others to kind of get a high level sense of how we're going.
And so how do we actually choose the monitoring sites for doing that work? So I imagine it's very labour intensive having to do the monitoring, and that's why we use camera traps and such like. But even then, you're analysing lots of pictures. So I guess there must be a bit of a science around choosing those monitoring sites as well, isn't there?
Yeah, that's right. So when we've defined our targets, we want to be able to set up a monitoring program that's able to support us in gaining insights into those targets and the condition of them, and then also gain insights in how we're tracking against towards our goals for each of those targets. And there'll be a range of different indicators that have different degrees of sensitivity. So you want to be able to monitor things that can tell you things in a shorter time frame, because you don't want to get to 5 years and go, oh, Jesus, we should have done something. We should have, been monitoring more things. So there's a range of sensitivity with different types of indicators, but it is also making sure that you've got the representation of the target itself. But then you're also wanting to make sure that you've got sites that have been that are looking at the monitoring threats as well. So places that you might have seen, or as we're learning more about the reserve, higher population of particular types of species, feral predators, feral herbivores, that kind of thing. So it's really around setting up sites that you've identified in that CMP process, around your targets, where they are located, and your threats and where they're located, and also where you're going to implement those strategies.
Yes, and in terms of monitoring our effectiveness, I know that's the big challenge, as we said right at the beginning, and it's not a short-term game, is it? Sometimes it can take years or decades even to understand what that impact is we're having. And I know some of the supporters asked me, well, this project that I've helped you operate and run, what's the results? And it's always a challenge to have to say, we don't know yet. But Vanessa, perhaps you can talk to us a bit about that, because I know out at NARE, that really is an interesting place, isn't it, in terms of trying to monitor how what we're doing makes a difference, given how variable the flood and drought cycle is.
Yeah, and I think I wanted to say before that one of the things that really excites me about working at Bush Heritage is that when we buy a property, we buy it and protect it in perpetuity. So there's an opportunity there to really get to know those places and to really learn and improve and do some of that long-term monitoring, which is quite rare given government election cycles, funding cycles, and even PhDs are often 3 to 4 years long. We've got these properties forever, and we're committed to looking after them and learning as much as we can about them, so we can protect them more. At NARE, it's quite tricky, particularly in relation to sort of measuring our effectiveness or monitoring our impacts around the vegetation. So out there, what you see on the ground is really, really driven by two main things, and one is flood water. And if it rains up north in Queensland, the water flows down either through the Warrego River or Paru and comes to Yantabulla Swamp. And the transformation in the bush is rapid and gobsmacking. It can go from dirt chip dry to absolutely alive with frogs and insects and water birds and just flowers and lilies, and it's just the most incredible transformation. And they're waiting for that floodwaters to come alive and do their thing, because they don't know when the next floodwaters will arrive. It's very unpredictable in terms of flooding out there. And the second key driver of how the vegetation and condition of the bush looks is around local rainfall. And what can happen is sometimes the floodwaters and the local rainfall come at the same time. Sometimes they don't. Sometimes they come in different seasons. And sometimes there's a really long time between any sort of a drink. And so what that does is it means that the bush can look really different. Different things flourish given those different situations. And so it can be really hard for us to then attribute any good management work we've done on how the bush looks, because there's this big overlying sort of factor around water, which drives how the vegetation responds. So really the only way we can do it is to commit to that long-term monitoring. And we've got an amazing botanist, really well-respected botanist, Dr. John Hunter, who has been doing monitoring there for 8 years. He's got plots all over the reserves and he goes back to the same locations. And he keeps telling me how fascinated he is by just how different the same plot looks in, year after year, given those different rainfall and flooding events. And so by building up a long-term picture, we can then start to compare apples with apples. We can say, well, under this flooding sort of scenario, the bush looked better after we did that management 10, 20 years later. You know what I mean? We'll be able to compare the same sorts of scenarios with each other and hopefully show that we've either maintained or increased the health of the bush, of our targets, as best we can. So that's, yeah, it's tricky, is the bottom line. But on the other hand, there are some really amazing examples we do have right now of impacts that we've had on the ground. So I used to work at Charles Darwin Reserve in Western Australia, and when we purchased that, we got rid of all the feral goats and the sheep. And what we were able to do is monitor the soil surface, and there's this amazing cryptogamic crust, which is like a living crust of lichen, moss, liverworts, and it sits on the soil surface and it helps with moisture retention and nutrient cycling and stops erosion. It's a very important component of a healthy woodland, and we've been able to quantify and specifically demonstrate an increase in the cover of that cryptogamic crust since we bought the property. It's a really good outcome. And there are other ones like where we've translocated phascogales in Kojonup, and that population is now thriving. And we've also got on Bulkamana, we've got yellow-footed rock wallabies returning to the bush, and on Urardi, we've got western quolls or truditch coming back to these reserves where we haven't recorded these species for, certainly since we purchased it. They're coming back now because we're doing this good management work. So there are some really clear good news stories, but there are also some really complicated long-term impacts that we're going to have to stick with it and keep monitoring to find out and really tell that story. But we're doing all sorts of things. We're doing pitfall trapping, we're doing targeted flora searches, we're doing acoustic monitoring, motion sensor cameras all across our reserves. We're trying to be really smart about how to measure those impacts and be able to tell those good news stories or any story that we find out that might help others, not just on our reserves, but elsewhere. So, yeah.
That's a great little survey, and you saw in some of the pictures while Claire and Vanessa were talking, there was quite a few pictures of people out in the field actually using technology and using traps and measuring the hind legs of small lizards and other vital data for monitoring. Sorry, Vanessa, yes.
I've got one more thing I wanted to say. The other thing about measuring impact is that when we buy a reserve that's more degraded, there's an opportunity for us to really measure and demonstrate a change or an improvement in condition. But sometimes some of our properties are in pretty good condition now, and our job is only just simply to maintain that condition as best we can. And so, the way we measure our impact, it's sometimes no dramatic wins, but just the win is that it's in the same good, healthy condition as it was when we previously monitored it. So yeah, there's all sorts of scenarios.
Fantastic. And as you said earlier, it's wonderful that our whole principle is healthy country protected forever. So we can take very long-term planning cycles. Mm-hmm. So it's good to hear. Well, these strategies and actions that we take, I know, are fundamentally grounded in science. And that means that we have lots of connections to researchers, to universities, to other partners and other environmental groups. Claire, I'd love to know how you see the importance of that in terms of us being able to do our ecological monitoring and the whole sort of ecosphere, if you like, of the work the conservation movement needs to do.
Thank you. It's critical. As part of that planning process, we identify that there's a lot of stuff we don't know, we don't want to walk alone. We want to work with other people and share knowledge and share different ways of seeing things. We've got over 50 collaborations with universities at the moment, and they play a critical role in supporting us to fill the knowledge gaps that we identify in our planning process. So as we go around the loop, we're looking at those targets again. And sorry, I keep saying footballs, and you probably think, why did she keep saying footballs? I'll stop saying that because I'm often in diagrams. So anyway, the targets. So we're looking at those targets, and there's lots of things about the targets we don't know. So they generate a list of knowledge gaps, which become research questions that form part of a knowledge strategy, which is on our website if you're interested in having a look. And that's just a whole list of specific questions that have been prioritised for things that we need to find out about our reserves. And within our priority landscapes. And to do that, we want to work with others, with different expertise, universities, other organisations. It's about sharing, it's about learning and to make the world a better place. And so that's why that's really critical, because while we've been lucky in the last couple of years where we're building our ecological resource, we've got more ecologists working on our reserves and more reserve managers and more staff generally. But it is about bringing and collaborating with those partners to be able to understand the world better than what we do now, and also to support young and emerging scientists and conservationists so they can, you know, that important on-ground experience of being able to do the practical side of the science they might be learning at university and school. So there's a kind of two-way approach to that, and the two-way right way approach too is working not just with our university partners but with traditional owners and the deep knowledge that they have of the landscape, having been here for tens of thousands of years. So it's really about working together so we can implement better science, better conservation actions, and basically save the world. But yeah, it's really critical. It's such a critical thing.
Yes, fantastic. Thank you. Well, most of what we've seen and talked about so far has been, I guess, what you call the scientific approach, which is very much a Western mindset and construct. But probably even more important than that is the knowledge of traditional owners on whose lands we have the privilege of working, and the partnerships that we are involved in terms of managing those lands and walking together to achieve outcomes that are both culturally and from a conservation perspective, a win for everybody. I know, Vanessa, you've had some fantastically deep and powerful and passionate experiences that you've shared with me in the past about your work with traditional owners. Perhaps you can give us a bit of a insight, because I know that really changed your view of what it actually meant to be an ecologist, didn't it?
Absolutely, yes. So I was lucky enough to work for 5 years with the Birrelly-Brew Rangers in the Birrelly-Brew Indigenous Protected Area, which is 6.6 million hectares of amazing desert country in the Little Sandy Desert. That's Mardoo country. It was absolutely amazing because prior to that, I hadn't had much experience working with traditional owners, but it was kind of my role to build the relationship with the rangers and work out how or if we could work together. And yeah, it changed fundamentally my perspective on how we can look after the bush, what it means to be an ecologist. I've got one little example, but there were so many. Do you know, Mardoo don't have, in terms of orienting yourself in a landscape, Mardoo don't have left and right. They only have east, north, south, east, west. Because if you think about left and right, it puts you as a centre of the universe and everything else revolves around you, whereas they see themselves as part of the landscape and they navigate around it using the east, west, north, south. And there's just so many subtle things like that were just really profound for me, and it was a really amazing experience. And so over the 5 years, the first step really was to get out on country and have a cup of tea by the fire, by the waru, and get to know each other and work out what Bush Heritage is interested in and what Mardoo are up to, and where there's a really neat alignment and overlap. And we basically came up with a whole range of projects. One of them was about monitoring bilbies. So bilbies used to be over 70% of Australia. Now it's 15% of Australia. And where they're left is on Aboriginal land. And Mardoo are so connected to the bilby that if you want to know where bilbies are out there, they know their tracks, they know what they eat. I mean, and there's all sorts of stories about them. And so, working with Mardoo on looking after bilbies was an obvious opportunity for us to work together. We also did a bush tucker program. I should say this partnership is well and truly still running. I've just moved over east, but we did bush tucker, so that was about collecting Mardoo names, Mardoo stories, and specimens, and scientific names, and putting it all together in a bush tucker book. And that's still happening, that's underway. We did things like monitoring feral predators using traditional tracking methods. We looked at managing weeds and fire together, and fire scar mapping was a way that you could integrate some of that more Western scientific technology in with the traditional methods. and traditional knowledge about how healthy country is driven by fire. So there were so many opportunities and projects that just made sense and that were just really rewarding. And I think, you know, really another thing I'm really proud of with Bush Heritage is, as an organisation, we've adopted a right way science approach, which is about fundamental respect for each other. It's about listening and learning to each other from the outset, from the very start of a project to the very end, making sure there's acknowledgement and opportunity to share and learn together. And you know, we obviously can't do it every time we do a project and everywhere, but wherever we can, there's a genuine focus and attention given to those opportunities, and they can be really powerful. Personally, yeah, as I said, life-changing, very rewarding. Even some of the social benefits from those partnerships, like watching some of the young rangers go out on country with some of the senior rangers, and the senior ranger says, yeah, good job. And the pride and it's just really powerful stuff. So I think, yeah, I'm really lucky to have been part of that. And now I'm lucky to be working with Dougherty, because there's some incredible traditional owners on Nari and Yantabula as well that we're working together with.
It's a great privilege, and I can tell from the passion with which you describe it whenever we talk that it's quite a life-changing experience. So thank you for sharing that with us, and thank you for that insight into ecological monitoring, both Claire and Vanessa. And now we're going to switch focus now and introduce our special guest, Hedley Grantham, who's joined us and giving us a wave there with a splendid hat, Hedley. Very dapper. You're the new chief scientist for Bush Heritage, aren't you? And I know you're joining a brilliant team of science and conservation professionals. Can you tell us what chief scientist is and what your work revolves around?
Yeah, thanks, Matthew, and hello everyone on Zoom. Sorry for any background music. I'm at the airport and there might be some elevator type music and announcements, but we'll see how we go. I just want to say first, you know, what really drew me to Bush Heritage is that it's really a science-based organisation and does science really well, to be honest. And, you know, we've just heard from Vanessa and Claire on some of the great work that, you know, is happening at Bush Heritage. And so I guess to sort of answer your question, I think a part of my job is going to be to help advance how science is done and how it's integrated into decision making. You've heard how we do planning and we do management plans and monitoring, and we need to think, you know, very strategically about what we measure, you know, on the ground and what data we're collecting and how that feeds into decision making. And so part of my job is going to be working with people like Vanessa and Claire and other people around the country. There's also a number of bigger initiatives that are ongoing and starting within Bush Heritage, and I'm starting to get involved with some of them. A good one is this climate ready revegetation project that's been going on, which is really cool, actually, to be honest. When I learnt about it, I was like, wow, that's really smart. And it's really about, you know, when we plant trees now and when we're trying to restore ecosystems, we want to be thinking about climate change and what the climate change impacts are going to be now and into the future, and planting trees and revegetating with that in mind. And so, for example, thinking about what is that future climate going to look like, and going to those places and seeing if we can get those same tree species from places that might be better to adapt to some of those climatic conditions in the future. And so, you know, really being strategic about, you know, what's happening and trying to build resilience as best we can to climate change. But the last thing I'll say, part of my position is also, it's a joint position with the University of New South Wales, and part of that is director of the Fowler's Gap Arid Zone Research Station, where I've just been this week. Here, this is a 40,000 hectare station where it's been a sheep station since the 1800s, basically. And so all of the sheep have now been removed, and we're really looking at how we can understand how ecosystems and species recover and respond to change when you remove sheep, when invasive species are managed. There's big exclosure fences going and in a very experimental manner, and long-term monitoring setup. And so there's a lot of overlap with the work that's happening there and what is relevant to bush heritage, and bush heritage will have a lot of input into that process, and likewise there's a lot of learnings that will happen there that can help with bush heritage too.
That's fantastic. And I know you've only joined us recently, but I know amongst our colleagues there are always some personal ambitions, like anyone who's seen those honey possum pictures that we've been distributing on social media. I know there's a huge gang of people who want to go see honey possums in WA. Now, you may have loftier goals, as befits your position as chief scientist, but anything that you particularly see as something you'd like to achieve or, you know, see in your time with bush heritage?
That's a great question, Matthew. I would very much like to see a honey possum. I guess I'll give you two answers to this question. One, the conservationist and the twitcher in me would say night parrot for sure.
Yes.
But the answer I'm going to give you would be quokka, because they're just so damn funny. I'd just love to see a quokka. I haven't seen one before, and maybe I can go try and see one when I'm finding the honey possum.
Yes, well, indeed. Well, I share your status as a twitcher and a non-seer of night parrots or quokkas at this stage. So we'll have to join forces on that one. So, well, thank you, Hedley. Now we've got time for some questions now, which have been coming through. So please, if you have any questions for any of our colleagues today, please stick them in the chat. And I'm going to start with some that came through just at the beginning. There's a question about condition. Now, I think both Vanessa and Claire talked about we have to measure condition. And what the first question is, what is condition? Is that some measure against a benchmark, or is it an arbitrary thing that we decide what's you know, good or bad? And then linked to that, a second question was the understanding that whatever condition you're measuring, it's not isolated on our reserves. You're influenced by the broader landscape and your neighbours, as well as other things that are outside our direct management control, and like climate change that Hedley's talked about. So Claire or Vanessa like to respond to either of those as they're sort of on the technical side?
Yeah, so condition, it can be measured in a whole range of ways. Generally speaking, we're talking about in the sense of the faunal assemblage, the plants, the soil, the water. Are they healthy? Do they look like we would hope they look? So in that respect, there is a sort of a benchmark element to it, but sometimes we don't know what the benchmark is because everywhere in the region's been degraded by grazing or whatever it might be. So yeah, it's a tricky one. It depends on where you are, but usually we're looking at an ecosystem level, we're looking at a range of things to measure to get a sense of how healthy the bush is. If that's enough of an answer for that one. And yeah, is that?
Yeah, absolutely. And I was just going to add that some things may feel like they're beyond control, but part of our principles when we do bioreserve is that we engage with all the other landowners and stakeholders in the region, and we attempt to collaborate as broadly as possible on programs that are of mutual interest. So obviously feral control is something that everybody always joins up with if you're trying to reduce the number of goats or pigs or foxes or cats in a region. But equally, I know our reserve managers look to influence other landowners nearby on conservation things. So for instance, you know, helping revegetate a particular corridor down a waterway to provide some connectivity. And we have some very interesting projects that are evolving at the moment where we're talking to a group of farmers on a particular watershed in Victoria, where we're looking at that group of farmers wants to both get better primary production, so they make more money, but equally they recognise their stewardship of the land and want to get better outcomes for conservation. So we're actively engaged with them across the landscape, and none of their farms are the sorts of properties we would buy, but working with them it's a whole of landscape, a whole of catchment approach to how we can influence and improve for wildlife and creating those sort of corridors and better habitat. So
yeah,
and
the other thing I was going to say is sort of a lot of, you know, the threats we manage on our reserves. It depends on the size of the reserve. So for some really small reserves, if we try to control feral animals, really they're just going to keep coming in from the neighbouring property. So we always try to work with our neighbours and try to have a regional landscape scale approach. It's something that's really fundamental at Bush Heritage. We work at the landscape scale. We're trying to manage landscapes. We tend not to build fences. We like to allow landscape scale processes to happen. And so with that in mind, we have to work at a bigger scale, and that's really important to us. We want to work just beyond our reserves. We want to work with our neighbours. Yeah, and I think one more thing was just I learned out in Birriliburu country what, you know, good condition is, what healthy country is. You know, traditional owners hold a lot of knowledge about what good condition is, and we draw on that whenever we can as well. And that's yeah, not necessarily written in a book or in a publication or a benchmark, but it's that knowledge held with traditional owners, and that can be really important for us as well.
Yes, thanks, Vanessa. There's another question from Jonathan Eastman. It's about how you control feral predators and their feral prey, and that interesting conundrum, which is take rabbits and foxes. If you manage to knock down all the rabbits, do the foxes then turn to native wildlife, and do you get unexpected outcome? Or vice versa, if you knock off all the foxes because you don't want them eating native wildlife, do you then have a rabbit plague that eats every bit of vegetation? So any comment on how we balance that, or how we take a scientific approach to that?
Yeah, it's tricky. Everything's connected. And the bottom line is we have to very much understand our reserves and what's happening on those reserves before we intervene. And we can't just look at one species at controlling one threat. We must think about how that can impact other threats and other native species and other targets. And so often, if we're going to do any sort of rabbit control, we need to be doing feral predator control as well. And we need to try things carefully and monitor closely and be adaptive and be open to not doing the right thing the first time and learning from it and sharing those wins and losses with everybody we can. But it is tricky and it changes with seasons and habitats. Like it's yeah, one answer doesn't fit everywhere by any means. And so that's why we've got ecologists and reserve managers all over Australia trying to really understand what's going on each reserve. And that's again comes back to that long-term vision that we have and the long-term approach that we have to our reserves, so we can look at these tricky things closely before we intervene and do our very best to have a good positive conservation outcome.
Fantastic. Now there's a couple of quick ones I'll try and knock over in terms of the questions. There's one question about whether we use drones to do monitoring, and I know we do that, and drones are fantastic tools to be able to do a degree of monitoring. And I reckon we could probably do a whole webinar on drones. So I'm not looking for a particular answer on that one, but to whoever asked that question, yes, drones are an essential tool in our toolkit for not just monitoring, but for actually taking, doing conservation actions. It's not just photographing. There's some amazing things you can do with them now. The second question was compaction and whether that's an issue for the land. And I guess we know that what I call the horrible hooved herbivores that we're blessed with in this country, like goats and pigs, that do compact the land and damage it and destroy those cryptogamic crusts that Vanessa talked about. I'm not aware whether that's a specific issue on our properties, but I guess given most of the ones we acquire are pastoral, before we take them on, then it must be an issue. I don't know, Claire, whether you've got a view on that, or any of the panelists.
Yeah, I mean, jump in, but definitely an issue, and I guess that's one of the key things when we do acquire a property that if it's still being up to that point used as an agricultural property, we'll be moving the sheep or cattle off to then start to heal the landscape, and it will be over time. But it's again though some of those key critical indicators that Vanessa's mentioned previously is starting to make sure that we're monitoring how the soil and that compaction is being managed, and the land's coming back to the condition that we want it to be in. Yes,
fantastic. Well, listen, I've got a question for Hedley directly that's come in. This is a bit of a curly one, so feel free to give a politician type answer to it. But I think it's a fascinating question. Apparently on the radio this morning, there's been a mention about the researcher at Melbourne Uni who is hoping to be able to recreate the thylacine from stored DNA in the next decade or so, and then eventually release a thylacine or thylacine-like animal back into the wild. And the question is, do you think it's an appropriate use of technology to support conservation outcomes, this sort of recreation of past organisms?
Thanks for that one. I think it's very interesting research. It's obviously ambitious, probably quite expensive. I do think the priority should be on what we have in place now and getting things in the best state it can be as sort of first priority, and we don't want that funding to be diverted to some of these sort of very R&D type research that may or may not work in 10, 20 years. So certainly not opposed. I mean, it's a shame we lost the Tasmanian tiger, and the ecosystems have adapted over time, but yeah, I think focusing on what we've got and what we can do now is first priority.
And I guess there's a space, much as the natural world has a very broad environment with different niches, there's different niches for everybody's type of research, isn't there? And without it, we wouldn't get some of the breakthroughs. So, but thanks for that answer. We've also got a couple of minutes left. There's been some very specific questions around very specific pests. So I'm just going to mention the beasties, and then if any of the panelists would like to respond with any insight into these. One of the questions was, are we grappling with cane toads? Which I think is a lovely tactile question, because when you pick them up, they are magnificent beasts, even though they are a pest. So, but are we tackling them in a conservation sense, which I think is what the questioner asked, and is it an issue for us? A similar question about camels and at Etherbuka and Craven's Peak, or rather Palunga. Are we still having to deal with, managing water supplies that are maintaining, too high a level of camels in the environment? And a really interesting one here, which is about feral omnivores like the rats and mice, house mice, black and brown rats. Are they an issue for us? And they're not questions I've come across before. So anybody like to comment on cane toads, camels, or the smaller rodents?
Can I just start with going back to that process? If we were looking at things we care about, so our targets, and then the next part of that is target health, but then also what's impacting on the target. So that's where we look at all the threats. And if a cane toad, for example, is something that comes through as being a threat, it will be identified in our management plan. And cane toads are a threat all across the north. I don't know how far they've actually come down, but it'll be identified in our management plan if it's actually impacting on our targets. And then we rate the threats, so, from low to very high, and depending on how they're impacting on the targets, that will then generate a kind of priority of which threats we need to manage first. So it kind of comes through in that. Same with camels. I'm happy to respond to that question specifically out of session, because I can't, I'll have to go into a management plan now and have a look. But camels are still on the property as far as I'm aware, but I don't know what their threat rating is just now off the top of my head. And also in terms of managing water, that would have been a strategy that was identified to help to mitigate threats. So it's all linked, and if we've planned and gone through that process as we do, it's all identified in our management plans. And as for the mices, I might be hand that to Hedley or Vanessa if you've got any thoughts on that one, but I can't think of any projects that have currently have that as a specific threat at the moment.
No, not that I'm aware of. Might be, yeah, but not that I'm aware of.
No, it's certainly not something that has come up in any of the work I've been involved in. Okay, one last question, I think, for Hedley, which is a very technical question from Drew. In the climate-adapted re-veg space, how do you mitigate against the risk of outbreeding depression via introduction of non-local genotypes? And you may wish to explain that in as much of a lay way as you can, Hedley, for the benefit of the non-scientists attending today.
So, yeah, no, thanks, Drew. I guess it's referring to ensuring there's genetic diversity there, so that that the population is as healthy as possible genetically. So at the moment, I mean, I can talk, specifically, Drew, if you want to get in contact. But what we do is we don't just go to one site; we go to several different sites. And there's an experimental design that brings in lots and lots of different seeds from different places, and it's a very experimental approach to see what's going to come up. And then there's these grids and randomizations and all sorts of sciencey stuff to try and make sure it's going to be as successful as possible, while also seeing what's coming up, what's adapting now, and measuring that into the future as the climate changes, which one of those different populations are growing faster and better, and those sorts of things.
Excellent. Well, thanks, everybody. I think we've covered most of the questions that have come through, and I'm just having a quick look to see. Oh, no, here's one for Vanessa. In terms of your work with traditional owners, Vanessa, how did you get approval from the local people to do the conservation work? Can you give us a bit of an insight how that dialogue goes? Because it's a very important part of the getting to know, isn't it, process early on?
Yeah, so really what the main focus of Bush Heritage is, either we buy a property and look after it, or we partner with others, and particularly traditional owners. And in the partnership space, it's really about working out where there's opportunities, where there's mutual interest, how we can support each other, where there's a common goal, that sort of thing. And it's about building trust. And usually it involves us working on Aboriginal land with the traditional owners. And so it's driven by the traditional owners more, and we're more supportive. On our properties, before we even purchase a property, we make sure that we have the support of the traditional owners. And then when we do purchase the property, very, very much at the top of the list of jobs to do is to build those relationships with the local traditional owners, and to work out what their interests are, and what their connection to the country is, and how we can work together and get to know that property together and build projects together. So it's they're different depending on the property or partnership space.
I don't know how deep that relationship goes, and how it takes time and trust, doesn't it? And seeing the same faces for a while, because many of our new partnerships in different parts of the country come about because one group or one clan have said, these guys are right, talk to Bush Heritage. Because there's that trust of working in one space, and we get approached to then start a dialogue. So that's a very important element in the relationship, that it's done as equals, and we walk together, don't we, along that pathway?
Absolutely. Yeah.
Well, thanks, everybody. I think we're pretty much up at time now. I'd like to thank Vanessa and Claire and Hedley for joining us today in National Science Week. It's been great to hear some of the boffins of the organisation explaining what underpins the great work that we regularly talk about out in the field. Thanks, everybody, for joining us and for your questions. If there's any we haven't got to, we'll attempt to follow up with you directly. And thanks for your contributions. Lovely to see everybody, and we look forward to seeing you next time. And there'll be a wonderful slideshow to finish off with, which will feature some of our Victorian acquisitions and some of the wonderful flora and fauna. So please stick around if you'd like to watch a bit of a slideshow. Hedley, Claire, Vanessa, thank you. And thanks to Megan, who's been producing this in the background. See you all next time.